I'm Eivy. I developer solutions architect at Disney. And so earlier, I think you mentioned that all these videos would be online. And unfortunately, even though I was able to fight the corporate battle of being able to speak here, I'm not able to share the video online afterwards. So this will be it. This is a singular experience. And it's funny. So my email is up here in case you guys want to talk to me afterwards. Send me some notes. But I'm here to talk to you about the developer experience of containers and Docker. But first I'm going to tell you why that's important to us. So I work for a group in corporate Disney that works on shared services. So as many of you may know, Disney is a huge company that encapsulates ESPN and ABC and Parks and Marvel and Disney Interactive and Infinity Games, and it's insane. There's a lot of giant players, and then we have a ton of little like mom and pop shop apps like Disney Wedding and Disney Baby and all these things, right? So we have thousands of developers, but more challengingly, we actually have thousands of products and services that are totally unrelated, don't even talk to each other, don't even operate together. We've even got like, air conditioning in the parks. There's like infrastructure services that we have to deal with. So I'm on a small functional architecture team. It was like 3 people last year, and now it's like 12 people. We've grown quite a bit. But we basically make things a little bit more performant, secure, stable, and scalable with the different teams. And we look at, okay, ESPN needs something. ABC probably is going to need something similar. They're both in broadcasting spaces. So we see a lot of shared problems between these companies that we can create a shared solution for and take away some of the redundancy. On my team, I focus on the developer experience because I believe very strongly that if we want developers to do the right thing, we have to make a great experience out of it. Developers are really good at getting a roadblock and then hacking a solution around it, which is really fun, but it also means when you're dealing with multiple companies that are comprising a whole that we get a lot of redundancy, a lot of reinvention of the wheel. I actually had about 3 years ago, discovered that just in the Seattle office, we had 4 different teams making an F5 VIP management tool. Like that was common practice. We had, even just in these little silos in one office, different teams building the same things. So we all are familiar with user experience, right? It's roughly a measure of emotions and attitudes towards using a particular product or service. And as we all know, users, if something doesn't work for a user, right? If one app doesn't work, they use a different app, right? We expect that users will have zero tolerance to failure in our applications, right? They'll just go to a competitor. They will stop using it. Developers sometimes have that freedom, but developers also have a different way of thinking about things. So when I talk about developer experience, I'm really talking about flow state. Oh, actually, no, it doesn't matter up there. Okay. We're talking about the measure of flow state in using products and services, and oftentimes in using multiple products and services together. Flow state's complicated, right? It takes time to get into flow state, to have this zen, I'm working and things are going great, but it can be broken in a second by a single tool. And developers oftentimes will, rather than just saying, I'm not going to use this thing anymore, they'll build a whole new tool of their own in order to fix a problem. So ultimately, we're really just talking about humans using computers, right? Whether we're talking about users or developers. But there's a big difference here, and that is how we face the problem, right? How we ask the question. So I see all the time when we bring people into new hires in, or when we try and collaborate together, is we collaborate across our business units all the time, and we oftentimes lead with this question: how does this thing work? And we present architectural diagrams, right? We definitely couldn't do at Uber, but we'll try to do it. We'll be like, yeah, this is a whole complex system, and here, we use all these frameworks and languages and libraries, and this is how it all works, and that's how we kind of bombard people with how to get started. And that's all really important stuff to kind of figure out as you go, but I don't think it's the leading question. Right? The leading question takes us more to Brooks' Law, if any of you have heard of this, but to criminally reduce this to a tiny phrase, basically states that when you start a project, as you add people to that project, you increase the timeline of delivery on it. So maybe you've seen that happen before. There's lots of reasons for that, but the main reason is ramp-up time. So we get people in, and I've worked on teams that are like, yeah, it takes about 2 weeks to get somebody to contribute code to our product. I've been on other teams where they've been in a couple of days, and through some automation and changing of how we bring people on and what questions we ask, we've reduced that to less than an hour of actually getting somebody just to write code and actually help contribute. So this is the question that I like to lead with when we have people coming in and starting to use our products, right? Or when I go to a team and I say, hey, I'm going to make your system more performant, or help you scale. I need to get bootstrapped into your application. And as I've done this to many teams, I've gotten answers like this, to how do I get bootstrapped? I think so-and-so knows, so-and-so's not here anymore, but they set up a README, it's kind of outdated. Our project doesn't have a README. I've seen that a number of times. Or you need 2 versions of this software because one part of the stack uses this version, another part uses that version. Or if you're using that team's service, it's going to conflict on a port with this team's service, so you have to turn that off or configure one with a different port, and then you're going to have a snowflake. And then once you get down to it, once you start onboarding, you end up with this like, okay, why can't Nokogiri compile, or why can't Node JIP compile every time I upgrade Node SAS freaks out on one of this, there's some reason why it doesn't work on your machine. And so I've learned that onboarding is painful, right? We repeat these patterns. And it's not just onboarding, but collaboration. We're constantly trying to help each other on these different teams. We're not new hires, we're just helping out. And everyone's machine is different, right? We run a lot of MacBook Pros, but we have slightly different versions of OS X, and we have different software installed on them and different service relationships, and people have snowflaked their port mappings, and some people are running Nginx because they prefer it, and some people are running Apache, and all kinds of craziness. And then to make matters worse, we spend all this time trying to get our apps working on OS X or Windows, and production doesn't run that way, right? It's not running on Windows or a Mac. And then the next person comes along after we've done this a few times, and again, things change and repeat, and it still doesn't work on somebody's machine, and it's a nightmare. So we battle this in a couple ways. One is we make a standardized README, so it's not acceptable to have a code base that doesn't have a README. And the README is fairly simple, right? It says things like, what are the contributing guidelines? If I do a pull request against this code base, is it going to be accepted? Is it actually still being maintained? Is there a chat room where a team can answer questions about this thing? What happens with logging? Like, how do I test the app? And most importantly, how do I bootstrap myself with it, right? And so the thing at the very top of the README is the dev getting started guide. And really all that does is points to an automated idempotent developer setup script, right? It's automated because we don't want to document manual steps in a README of how to get over setting this thing up. And it's idempotent because not only are you going to do this on day one, but every day as you're working on this product to start, stop, test, rebuild, etc., you're going to use this automated tool. So, because as soon as you stop testing this stuff, that's when your apps go down this legacy road, right? We've had several apps where people come over and they're like, do you know if so-and-so still works here? Because I don't know how to build this app. I don't know how to test it. It's in Git. I'm like reading through the code, and I just have no idea. So we've learned automation trumps documentation. It's great if you can document the caveats to dev setup, but if you can automate it, that's so much better. I'm not going to name any names, but I spent a lot of time reviewing tools for use, and I found one that the dev quick start guide literally said, step 1, download this zip file. And I was like, oh, all right, this is going to be, it's no brew install or anything. Download the zip file, okay, unpackage it. Okay, now set this env var, and make sure you have this version of the JDK installed, and there's no link or anything. Just make sure you have it. And then if you're on a Windows machine, you're gonna hit these issues probably. And if you're on a Mac, you're gonna hit these issues. If you're on 10.10 or 10.8, you're gonna hit these other ones. And I was looking at this just massive list of caveats, and I was like, man, this could all go in a bash script. Like, they could have just detected the state of the system and said, look, prompted you, hey, go grab this thing and install it if I can't automatically install it for you. And so if your developer setup is more complex than paste this thing into a terminal and go, then you're going to break the developer out of flow state, right? They're trying to use something, they get blocked, and they have to go back to documentation to read some errata for setup, then they get blocked. And they're going to either choose something else, you're going to lose them, or they're going to build some hack around your setup. So this is the dream. This is what we want to do, is go to any team, any service, and this is a public version of something that we've done internally, and just clone it and run a dev init script and get a cup of coffee and come back. And I should be able to do this on a brand new machine or a machine that I've been using for years that already has a bunch of software on it. And I shouldn't have to have pre-installed Maven or NPM or Java or anything like that. I shouldn't have to do any manual configuration. And more importantly, I shouldn't even care that the app is a Java app or a Node app or a PHP app or a Ruby app or whatever. It's not really it's inconsequential. Really what I want is I want to be able to run the app. And then I can dig into it, right? We hire smart engineers. I used to teach web development, and I told people the best thing you're going to get out of a tech education is just how to learn new things. Because you're going to go to a company, and they're going to have whole new ways of doing things, and you're going to learn a framework, but then you're going to get thrown into something, and companies have their own frameworks, right? We write a lot of stuff around things. So if we can do this, then we have happy DevOps, right? We've actually black boxed our app, and we can ship it more reliably. We can also build all that infrastructure that goes around our app on our dev machines. Because right now we face this. We have our app code, right, that's in Git, and developers take that and make some change to it and throw it to the build server, and it gets built and thrown in the artifact repository like Nexus. And then that is available for deployment. And then outside of that, we have this whole managing Tomcat or Apache or Nginx or whatever, and Node and PHP or whatever else is going on there, and even custom system configs. So many of the apps we build, we tweak U limits or we tweak something on the system. There's some other extra configuration. And that's outside the dev process and the build process. This is scary to me. I look at this and I'm like, you mean when we update Node.js or we update, change the value in the U limits, that's not part of the build? It's not. That's insane. And then, of course, I chatted with a team about containerization, and for a moment they were confused, and they said, well, we don't get how containerization is really going to work with our setup, because in QA and below we use Nginx, and above we use Apache. And I said, well, are you moving to Nginx? And they said, no, a developer had Nginx, and then we deployed it that way to QA, but then the ops guys wanted to use Apache because they do Apache Tomcat, and that's what they wanted to do. And then I saw it click, right, when somebody on the team was like, oh yeah, but we don't want to do that. Yeah, this is the inconsistency that we're trying to solve. We don't want to have that kind of setup. And so we start making this argument for, all right, Docker, we'll containerize things, because that's going to take us to this brave new world where we'll actually have the base operating system and the system security patches and changes to the file system and the actual hard version of your web server softwares and your languages and all the frameworks tacked in there with your app code, because really that is your app. The thing that's the app code in Git is not the only thing that is the app. So we throw that as an image into our artifact repository, and then we don't have surprises at deployment time, right? If we want to do a security patch update or an update to Node or Java or something like that, we can do that and then put it to the build server to figure out if things still work. And we can take this artifact now and throw it in a performance environment. And when we tweak ulimit changes and we want to see if that actually worked, we can actually test it without having to monkey with the things at deployment time. Okay, so developers start looking at Docker. We start training people on it. And we have a lot of Java folks, Node folks, Ruby, all kinds of stuff. And they start looking at this stuff and they're like, wow, that's a lot of tools. It's a big ecosystem. It's a lot of API docs. It's a lot of tools that are doing a lot of the same things that are either complementary or contradictory. And there's a lot of decisions to be made about this. And so now we're looking and we're like, okay, we have Disney Interactive and ESPN and ABC and shared services, Parks and Resorts. We're all doing this investigation independently. We're all solving these problems independently, and we're all facing the same problems, right? We're facing, why didn't this thing work with Docker Compose, or why can't I sync to VirtualBox, or we're dealing with Node.js developers who have, they're running gulp with live reload. They just expect things to work. When they hit save, browser changes. They don't wait for builds. And now we're throwing a virtual machine in the mix And we had an issue with one team in onboarding because they were like, well, I hit save, and it took like 5 seconds for the virtual machine to realize that the file changed and to sync it and for live reload to work. What's going on with that? And then, these tools out from under them change. We went from Vagrant and Docker to boot to Docker machine. And so that's a lot of churn in the learning experience. And I swear every other day somebody pops into our Docker chat and says, does anybody know how to get Docker working with Cisco AnyConnect VPN client? And we've answered this like, we spent weeks, hacking around solutions or partial fixes or, just ditching it and going with OpenConnect, like all kinds of hackery around that. Which leads us to this, custom hack solutions, right? Every team is fixing these problems independently. This is an example of one, right? One crazy hack solution for taking it, making it so that if you aren't running your code in the user's directory, which is automatically mounted in VirtualBox, you're running an opt or something like that, and you don't want your virtual machine to run out of disk space, this creates a symlink and uses Docker rsync to mount stuff in there, or to keep it in sync in your virtual machine. This is just a nightmare. It works most of the time, and it got some people around some issues in onboarding, but it's not an optimal solution, right, ultimately. And so our developers kind of look like this sometimes when they go to coffee shops and get away. The good news is that these problems have nothing to do with getting Java or PHP or Node running on Windows or OS X. We're not trying to get our apps working now. We're trying to get infrastructure working. We're trying to get Docker or containers running on our machines. So that's actually really exciting. This is where I like to be because we're not talking about this product team. We're not even talking about this company, right? This shares across all of us. So we can hit the wall once, we can automate it, and we can share solutions. So this is an example of, this is something we pushed to public GitHub. There's a private version of this internally that does a lot more. But basically, we created a Yeoman generator. Yeoman, for those of you who don't know, it's an app scaffolding tool. So basically, it just asks you a bunch of questions and then injects those answers into template files and dumps those files onto your file system. So you can do npm install, yo, and generator dockerize, or if you don't even have npm, because we like to be friendly for people who don't have Node yet or fresh laptops, you can curl a setup script to YOLO and YOLO that. And then you can just go to your existing app directory or a fresh directory and say yo dockerize, and it will ask you a bunch of questions and drop in some scaffolding tools. And this was important because we have a ton of apps already and we're trying to Dockerize heavily. And so we wanted to be able to take our existing apps and just say, look, I just want to get some quick tooling. I don't want to have to like read all the documentation of all the different tools about Docker and make a bunch of decisions. I just want to get whatever the standard is injected into my service. And so it does this. We've already converted our GitHub repos to make sure we have an app directory, which gets mounted into the Docker file. And so it drops in a base Docker file, Docker Compose, dev config, and dev init, and a dev script, which has a generic set of facades to Docker Compose and other tools, as well as some helper scripts. And it's just exposed some simple commands, right? So we can say, hey, what's your dev setup look like? Just run dev init, right? And that will make sure that your machine can run Docker and has everything set up, all it needs, and it will start the app. And then you can start, stop, restart, get a shell into the primary container, all that kind of stuff. And test, right? That's another question that we just automate away the answer to. How do I test this? And if people are playing with an insecure Docker registry, which happened, we're like, hey, we have an insecure registry and everybody wants to play with it and throw some stuff in there. But it's a pain to be like, hey, what do you do again to allow that insecure registry? Let's just throw that in a little one-line tool so everybody doesn't have to like reinvent going through and figuring out how to get into the Docker VM and add that to the boot to Docker profile. And then if somebody does a bunch of bash foo and they're like, hey, look, I have all these untagged Docker images or dead containers and I want to clean it up and just free some space, instead of like pasting this out of Evernote or remembering the bash foo, they can just say dev free and free up some space and be golden. And when they push that out, right, we create these solutions, these extra little augmented tools. People can update it and update their code base's version of the dev toolkit. and then everybody's got this stuff. So the whole point is this manages Docker, not the app, right? It's just simple bash scripts, idependent software installs, just automates. The app is still configured in Docker file. We're just creating a generic toolkit. But it has some requirements and limitations, right? We expect that you have converted your GitHub repo so that your app is inside of a subdirectory. That's become a standard now with our setup. And it, right now, assumes the developer's using OS 10. That's like 90% of our developers, so that's pretty simple use case. And we also assume that you're cool with Homebrew, because that's how it is going to install stuff if you don't have it on your machine. So it's somewhat limited, and that's not perfect, right? So one thing I'm excited about that I've been playing with for the last week is Docker for Mac and Windows. Docker just recently announced this thing. It's in closed beta, but you can request access. It removes a lot of the headaches that we were experiencing. So it has native hypervisor support, so there's no more VirtualBox. It has native networking, it's native apps, so that takes away the VPN problems. It basically makes it a lot simpler, right? You no longer have that extra layer of cake in the stack. So we're going to keep going down this path until I go to every team in my org and say, how do I get on your product? And they say, oh, you just run dev init, because it should be that simple. Thanks. I could do a little demo. I think I have a few more minutes. So let me do that. So I have these two services. I can bump these up for you guys. And if I just dev start these will start up there are a couple of Node.js apps fronted by Nginx, so there's 2 containers in each. And then they use a shared console service to register themselves, and then as nodes go in and out, they will update Nginx with what exists there. Let me pop out of full screen mode here. So I hit dev start, and that just went ahead and it ensured that Docker was all good, and then it did the Docker compose up, and then it launched these 2 services. And they can see each other. Pretty simple. Got them up and running on my machine. And I'm running Docker for Mac, so it's on localhost. It's not actually in a VM IP like it was before. And I could map that in a hosts file if I wanted to. But yeah, that's it. So, and then I could say Docker compose, scale, scale that one to 4. And then when I go to one of these, once console registers it, there we go. Now this guy's just showing, oh yeah, behind the LB, behind the Nginx, there's actually 4 services now that I can play with. So anyway, I used Container Pilot, which Joyent set up. They had a great blog post for it. So it was a lot of fun. All right, questions?
Excellent. Adam, thank you very much.
All right.